If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you.
Hello Internet, we are back, and I have to make a confession here too actually. The first one is all the windows are open. There's a heat wave here in Europe, so there might be a little bit of background noise, please forgive me, but if not, I'm going to sit here sweating like a pig in Palestine. I almost wanted to say something else, but there might be children listening here as well. And the second thing is, whenever I speak to a professional person, especially somebody who is a psychologist, or even a pastor, I want to know who's this guy. I want to know, does he actually know what he's talking about? And I don't mean in a professional sense of the word, because mostly we do actually. But I need to understand the person. I need to understand that if he says to me, understand the soldier, I want to know, well, have you served ever before? That's the first question I ask. I know it's a bit silly, but that's how I do it. And I think a lot of you people are also doing it. Now on Legacy, we have a psychology program. It is Frans van Staden, a 3-2 battalion member. He's sitting here smoking on the other side. And we've got Frans here. So Frans, thank you. Thank you for coming. Wonderful fellow this, I can tell you. I lived in his house for a few days when I was in South Africa, met his family. And in a serious note, when you see somebody's family, you can see actually harmony, and you can see where this man stands in life. And he stands as high as they go. But I asked him, and he was a bit reluctant, I have to admit. I said to him, Frans, please come and tell us about your military period. We've known you as a psychologist, and we invite all of you, if you have a problem with psychology, or you feel down, or you feel a need for Frans' professional help, please come and talk to us. It's an open invitation to anyone listening here. Come and help. We have help. I say we. In fact, he helped a lot of people here. We can't tell you names, things like that, obviously not. But I can tell you it made a major, major difference. And it didn't take him long to do it either, which I'm sure is very bad from an economic viewpoint. But Frans, thank you. Let us start at the beginning. Where do you come from? I mean, were your parents in the military that you do your national service first? Or were you one of these who went to university and then, went to the School of Infantry, as General Bowman said? Every time somebody says infantry school, I get like a shock. The general once said to me was School of Infantry. So anyway, from Boris, if you're listening here, welcome, sir. Frans, over to you. I'm keeping quiet now.
Of course, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the work that you are doing. I think it's absolutely essential that veterans take the opportunity to tell their story, that they can share with one another the lessons learned in the military, the application in life, and also that people can see that every veteran, whether you were on whichever side in life, put themselves and sometimes their families in harm's way for the cause that they believed in. And yes, sometimes people will disagree with me, but each and every veteran of any side took a severe risk for himself, and also had to contend with the thought and the possibility that you can lose your life in this pursuit. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Delighted to be here. I really feel privileged, and yes, I don't enjoy talking about myself. So I feel privileged to be here. So if I just talk briefly about my ancestors. My ancestors arrived in the Cape from Haarlem in Holland in 1686. He was called Martin van Staden, and he got his first farm or area to farm around Paarl in the Western Cape. And I'm the third of 3 children, 2 older sisters. When I was born in Brits, Northwest Province, my father was a tobacco farmer at that stage, and my mother was the nursing sister. She was actually the midwife in the Brits district in Northwest Province. And it just shows you sometimes how the rules were confused even in those years. We're talking now 1963, that she was the midwife to all races. And she traveled with a DKW van from farm to farm and from village to village to help mothers in labor. In 1965, we moved to Alberton, which is a small town, at that stage was a small town south of Johannesburg. And that is basically where I grew up. My mother continued working in the medical field. She was working in Alberton Hospital, and my father then started working for Alberton Municipality. My early days, I started primary school in 1969 at the age of 5. In those days, you know, I think parents wanted to get rid of you if you were too busy. You know, started with a friend, Louis Day. I think he's a school headmaster today. And he was my best friend from very early, and we were in the same class. So we were very naughty, and I recall getting my first hidings from the teachers at that stage already. And then in my second grade, grade 2, we moved to another neighborhood, and I went to primary school or law school, General Alberts. And that's where I also continued until grade 7 or standard 5 in our days. Played rugby, did whatever activities we had to do, and was selected then as a prefect and also as head boy, which I never expected, and I didn't know what to deal with it. But fortunately, at that age, you didn't have much to do. I then went to high school, Alberton Hoërskool, High School Alberton, and in 1976, I was then lucky to be selected to be in the under 13 rugby team. So that was probably the highlight of my early high school career. And our big distinction in that year was not to win our games, but to have no points scored against us. And even in 1976, I had the wonderful honor as a prop forward to score a try in the pre-game for the All Blacks or the Rebels in that year, 1976, on the then Ellis Park, which was before they rebuilt it. Now that was really a highlight. I think in my rugby career, I think I scored about 4 tries, so that was a major event for me. And then for a few years, I think for a number of reasons, I didn't play in the A team. And in 1980, we were fortunate to be invited to go and play in rugby in Belgium, our first and our second team of our school. And at that stage, I played second team prop. I was still, I think, the second or the third smallest player in the team. But I worked very hard in the gym to keep myself strong, and I continued playing prop forward, number 3, tight head, as we would call it. I was also very involved in the then drill squad for the school. I would sing in the school choir, and we also had the naghappies. Now, how would you translate that? The night monkeys. We were a serenade group that we would go to teachers and people that were ill that we knew of to go and serenade at their homes. So it was an informal group, and we had lovely friendships from that experience. So typically in in the South African circumstances as conscripts. At the age of 16, you would get some papers from the government to say, okay, now you need to indicate, where you're going to fulfill your national service. At that stage, I was grade 11 or standard 9. And I had the attitude, whatever you do in life, you do it to the best abilities. And of course, I then decided, well, if I need to go to the army, I'd go to the infantry. So I applied for the infantry, and lo and behold, I was selected for the infantry. Can you believe it? A lot of my mates went to other parts of the unit of the military, but I decided to go to the infantry. So I got my call-up papers. At that stage, at the end of matric, I must say, I didn't really perform very well. It was all about rugby, and then I had my first girlfriend, so my focus was elsewhere. Anyway, I passed matric by luck, and then I decided, let me go to the military first. So on the 14th of January 1981, I had to go to the Mill Park showgrounds, and there we were all got together. My late brother-in-law, Andre van der Merwe, in those years gave me a list of all the things that I had to buy. And I had like a big balsack, as we would call it, but a civvy balsack full of all the stuff. So I arrived there, and all my stuff had to be unpacked to check that I didn't, have drugs and so on. But eventually we got onto the train, and I could actually give the guys some of the snacks out of my balsack, and we actually had fun on our way to Middelburg for South African Infantry Battalion. Now, because we had to stop all over to pick up guys, we arrived there, I think it was after 10 at night. And Middelburg has a strange climate. Even in summer, it can be quite cold. So we arrived there not expecting to be in the cold. And then we arrived in the dark. We got to the rugby field, and there we were issued just with some basics. Now, typically, for South African Infantry Battalion was a feeder unit for a lot of the other units. So I think the unit was able to house about 800 people, and we probably had about more than 2,000 people there. So we had to sleep in tents that were against an incline above the rugby fields. And you would arrive there in the dark with your bedding, and in the dark you had to set it up, and obviously one didn't think of taking a flashlight along and so on. So but basically we slept the first night just where we could find a bed, and then in the next day we were moved into different tents, and there was more structure, and there were inspections, and obviously the training started, and you got issued with basic uniforms and all the injections and the medicine. I think the big thing that shocked me is when we all got our haircuts, because you get the number 1 haircut. So obviously my hair was fairly short, but we were divided into platoons, and after the haircut we had to go and form up in our platoons. And I walked out of the barber's shop, and I looked around, and I couldn't recognize any of the guys. And if it wasn't for the officer who basically called me closer and said, "Come here, you bloody troop," I didn't recognize anybody. Needless to say, I got stuck into it. I was fairly fit, I would say. And I just enjoyed the initial training. And obviously, during those first 2 weeks in Forsyth, you were then allowed to apply for different units. The Parabats arrived, and the South African Police arrived. And I recall well my cousin who shares the same names as I do. We were in the same matrics classes at school. He was also there with me. And he then decided to go to the police. And that was quite a shock to me, because I felt here was my buddy. We could confuse the army by sharing names, and sometimes we could jippo by using one another's names, or so we thought. So he left for the police, and that was quite a shock to me. The other person that I recall was Johan Versagi. He was my rugby captain. Tall Johan, he played lock forward, and we were together as well. So I still had another buddy. And we then applied to go to Oudtshoorn. You had to go through selection. You were interviewed by a captain at that stage. And I think what helped me to get selected was we were issued with old R1 rifles that we had to now learn how to maintain and keep clean and so on. And on one occasion, they had like a barbed wire fence, and then you had to cross that fence. And then our loot was there about 100 meters beyond the fence. And you had to now, advance and show your aggression and all of that. And typically, being a prop forward, you're a utility forward, or in that sense. I said, well, if nobody's going to fall on the the razor wire, I will do that. So I fell onto the razor wire so that everybody could run over my back. But I had one disadvantage. The steel helmet that we had in the military at that stage was only one size. Now I wear, and well, I only realizes the size of my head at that stage, but I wore a 63 beret and hat and everything else. And the steel helmet wasn't made for people with such large heads. So what would happen as I was lying on the wire? It wasn't painful because it was the old type razor wire, not the doringdraad as they would call it. So it didn't really cut into me. And as they were coming over, they would be kicking the steel helmet at the back, and it would be cutting me on my nose. So I had this like blood on my face. By the time I got up and they pulled me over, and then we ran. And then with this blood on my face, I stormed quite aggressively with my rifle, towards the loot. And I just stopped about a meter from him. Fortunately, I was thinking of putting on the bayonet at that stage. But it like shocked him. And, and he sort of stood there. And I said to him, I want to be a soldier. And I think that helped a little bit, because then he became aware that I was trying to do the very best. Because that was just me. Now, this is where the 32 Battalion story comes in. I never knew about 32 Battalion at that stage. And the first time I heard was when our loot was saying, after we were then placed in different units and his job was done at Forsyth, that he would probably want to go to 32 Battalion. And I heard about this, but I didn't know anything about it. But that stuck in my mind. So after 2 weeks, we were put onto trains, and we were 4 in a cabin, and we had a wonderful time, because the NCOs and officers on our train car were just totally chilled. I think they had their parties. They allowed us to have our parties. One of the guys had a music player. So the moment that the train moved, it would generate power, and then we would play music and, buy beers wherever we could buy, because you'd stop at all the stations at that stage. And we arrived in Oudtshoorn, I would say about 9-10 o'clock in the morning. And suddenly, you now are going to be at the School of Infantry, and it was going to be so serious, etc. And so these officers and NCOs were waiting for us at the station. And Yeah, people talk about the roofie ride. We had a bit of a roofie ride in Middelburg. But actually, we were quite surprised that we didn't get a roofie ride in the vehicles. Now, roofie ride, for those who don't know, they drive fast and they brake hard and they take corners, and it means that you're like in a washing machine at the back of the vehicle. And because we had canvas over the vehicles, we couldn't see where we were driving or whether the person was going to go to a stop or an intersection at all. So we arrived at Oudtshoorn at the base, and we were then placed into platoons. So I just ensured that I'm with Johan Versaghi, and we ended up in Alpha Company Platoon 2. Now, that's where the next part of 32 Battalion comes in. Our company commander then was Major Peter Rose. Now, Major Peter Rose was one of the Bravo group guys. And he studied, when he introduced himself, he said he studied Russian and Portuguese, and that he was going to make soldiers of us. Now, Major Rose was only there for a number of months, about, I guess, 3-4 months. But we were quite impressed because he wore flat sole boots, and he seemed to be a very good soldier. And obviously the 32 connection and Bravo group connection was clearly made. So we were quite in awe of him. Now, Alpha Company Platoon 2 at Oudtshoorn at the School of Infantry was right opposite the swimming pool. And there was a hindernisbaan. What would you call that? I've just forgotten the word. Obstacle course. There you are. Thank you, Chris. But because of some injury that occurred in the previous year, the obstacle course was not used, and we were not allowed to go there. So our platoons, our 7 platoons in Alpha Company, had the distribution of obviously officers and NCOs from the previous year. But our platoon 1 and 2 had 2 1-per ploots. In other words, they were second lieutenants, and the rest of the officers in the other platoons were full lieutenants. They were ex-teachers, so they were calmer, more relaxed with life. And we had 2 second lieutenants that were quite competitive. And it meant that platoon 1 and 2 for that year were the 2 platoons that competed to be the best platoon. Now, just to some of the platoon 1 guys like Gert and Jan Creer and Kenneth Swartz, all the 3-2 guys that ended up with us, Campbell Ace, Paul Boyens. I just want to say to you that in the end, platoon 2 was the best. There's no doubt about that. You were just visible because you were closer to the QM stores. But in platoon 2 was then Johan Versaghi. We also shared a room at some stage, and you were placed in rooms, and you always had the sword hanging over your head of, if you don't perform well, you are going to be RTU, return to unit, which meant you end up as a troop back in Forsyth. So we worked very well. Both platoons performed well. Our NCOs were exceptional. We had Corporal Jan Terblanche, or his nickname was Turbo. He went to Special Forces at a later stage. He's unfortunately passed away. And Johan Jordan was there. Yori, I think he became a senior officer in the military eventually. I think he's also has a doctorate, and he's involved with University of Pretoria. So we had 2 exceptional NCOs, and then Second Lieutenant Justice van der Walt. Our training was good. Our training was tough. We were very fit. We had to compete very well academically and then in terms of fitness. And at the School of Infantry, you have to complete the 2,4 in under 10 minutes with, as they call it, steel helmet, webbing, and your rifle. Now, I don't know whether that was just psychological, but I really struggled. I was very fit. With only my browns and my boots, I would run a 827. But the moment that I knew that we were measured, it was like your body tensed up. And I realized then how psychology plays a role in one's success in life. And it's that typical fight, flight, freeze, flop mode where you are so stressed about wanting to perform that your brain actually slams shut a bit. And that my muscles tensed up, and it was typically that fight, flight response. And only when I started calming myself down and I said to myself, this is something that you've run so many times, that I eventually got it under 10 minutes. But you must also now understand I'm an old prop forward. You know, I wasn't built for speed. I was built to carry loads and to scrum. Now, I quickly realized in that year in Oudtshoorn that I was way too small to play in the forwards. So I went for a few practices, and the prop forwards were people like Flippy van der Merwe, who was playing, who became Springbok in that year. I mean, guys that were twice my size and much stronger than I was, etc. So I decided that, you know what, rather than risking injury, I went to go and do tow track, tug of war. Now that was actually a wonderful experience, because you learned about working together. Because if you can be the lightest, the smallest, but if your technique is positive, you actually can hold your own against a heavier, bigger team. And if you move in unison, you know, the way that you dig in your heels, you pull at the same moment, etc., you can unsettle a larger team. So I did that for my sports in that year. And I think that also helped a lot in terms of getting my back and my legs strong. So during that year, during I think July, August, or August, September, you would do your counterinsurgency here at Oudtshoorn, and that meant that you would move into Namibia to a place called Umatea, and then learn how to do counterinsurgency war. Now, my dream was to go to mortars, 81 millimeter mortars. So just before we went to the border phase, we had the weapons platoon weapons phases and specialization phases. And I then applied to go and do my 81 millimeter mortars. I didn't know it at that stage, but academically I did very well in the company. I think I was, you know, top or second to the top in terms of my academics. And my loot didn't want me to leave the platoon and go to Delta Company, because that meant you would stay Delta Company. So he gave me the consolation prize of being number 2 for the 60 millimeter mortars. Now, for those who know, it meant was that old canvas kit that you had to carry 8 mortar bombs, almost like these flak jackets today, that you put it over, you've got 2 straps on your shoulders, and then you have 4 bombs hanging in front and 4 bombs hanging at the back. The problem with that is the inertia and the weight, gravity of that. So arriving in the sandy soil of Namibia and then doing vehicle exercises where you had to jump from the top of the buffalo or the buffle mine-resistant vehicle meant that every time that I jumped off, that my face would end up in the dirt, because this weight of the 8 bombs would pull me into the sand every time. So I regretted and I hated every moment that I had to jump down from the buffle. Now the buffle had side plates, armor side plates that you actually can drop down, so it's easier for you to jump off. But typically, School of Infantry doctrine, you don't drop that, you jump from the top. So that was very hard for me. So I had a face full of sand every time that we had to jump off. But we had a good time training and learned, and our platoon was really a collaborative unit, and I learned a lot about teamwork. So during the end of our first months in Namibia, Operation Protea was launched by 6-1 Mechanized Battalion. And they were obviously next to us at Umatea. And we were in awe late that one afternoon when the rattle vehicles and the support vehicles started moving up the tar road and then a sandy road leading up towards the Namibian, the Angolan border. And for various reasons, we were not included in the operation, but we were allowed to move over the border from Inanna base into Angola to go and do area operations and to just to support the main operation. So we went into not very far into Angola, and we did area operations, or as one would say, search and destroy operations. And there was one small contact in our company, but nothing too serious. Now, Tracer Ferreira was also one of our first year School of Infantry students who was injured in that small contact. And De Nobrica was also in Alpha Company, actually received an Honoris Crux for his bravery during that contact. So I think there weren't really big events in that time. We moved into Angola in our second month, and because we didn't have the wonderful kit that the soldiers have nowadays, with that canvas kit, we didn't have space for your food and blankets and sleeping bag, etc. So the 3 of us in the center of the platoon, that would be the RPG gunner, the mortar number 1 and the mortar number 2, myself, decided that we were going to take only one shelter for the 3 of us. We didn't have space for blankets. We tried to pack and repack. The almost semi-desert environment of southern Angola. So that meant that the 3 of us would have to spoon every night, sleep in the sand and just clear it a little bit, and then we would share that shelter. Now, it was great if you had a large bladder, because then you could sleep in the middle and you didn't have to move. But the moment that you had to get up at night and have a leak, it meant that you moved to one of the sides under the shelter, and then you would sort of almost freeze because of this August, September weather at that stage. So our return to Oudtshoorn was non-eventful, and basically we continued with our training, and then sort of I think it was around early November, when we were eventually assigned to new platoons, where you were either going to be a candidate officer or an NCO. I wanted to be an officer, but I accepted that any rank at that stage would be better than remaining a troop. And I was then delighted to be a candidate officer. And we were then placed in different platoons. Now, just for those who may not know, a candidate officer is lower than a troop, because you are now somebody who's got 2 white stripes basically on your shoulders, and that means that's a landing strip for every other rank to come and crap on you. And as they say, jy is laer as slankkak op die seebodem. I don't know what's the proper translation, but you are really lower than the bottom of the sea, if I put this gently. So at that stage, then we were starting to do the final leadership work and the leadership training, for lower level command and control. I think was the course known, or as they said in Afrikaans, LBBV. And that meant that you had to learn how to deal with people, to have empathy, to command, to control, and also work with other people as a leader. And I really enjoyed that part of it. And I think that sort of also started a small flame in me that I wanted to work with people one day. Then we had the opportunity to start preparing for the passing out parade. Now, the passing out parade at Oudtshoorn every year is a big event. I think it's like 3 or 4 days. Your families are invited, and that means all the company housing is vacated. You go and stay in tents somewhere, and the parents and the families basically stay in your rooms, and they are accommodated during the passing out period. So we were all very keen for that. And I was selected, and I think probably because of my previous drill squad exposure, to be in the first silent drill platoon. Now, our company's sergeant major, he was then Staff Fox van Onselen. He became a senior sergeant major, wonderful person and leader, whom I've had the privilege to meet again last year. And we as our platoon 2, we are extremely fond of him. A wonderful leader. I actually told him the other day, Fox, if I ever knew 40 years ago that I would enjoy you as a person that much, I wouldn't have been so scared of you. He was a very fair man, but had very high standards. So I was selected, and I felt very privileged to be selected in his squad. And he was going to take us through our first silent drill exhibition then during the passing out parade. At that stage as well, we were asked to go and indicate which units we wanted to join. And typically, initially, one thinks, okay, maybe something close to home, etc. Because in my time, I had already missed my elder sister's wedding because I was in the army. I couldn't get past. And then a number of us, and that's the further 32 Battalion connection. The Kruger brothers were in platoon 1. They spoke about going to 3-2. Their elder brother, who's passed away, Sarel, came to visit them on occasion. We heard the rumors that some Rekkies were in platoon 1 visiting, etc. Sarel was in 32 Battalion before, and so we heard about that connection. And it actually meant that quite a large number of us then decided to volunteer for 32 Battalion. I had the privilege, our company commander then, apologies, I should have said it earlier, Captain Hannes Smit, actually remarked some years later, I think he was colonel then, that more than half the leader group at the end of 1981 came from Alpha Company at the School of Infantry. So obviously a lot of us were more exposed and more aware of 32 Battalion because of the Kruger brothers, and we decided to volunteer. So obviously we didn't know when we had to move up. So one afternoon we just started our practice for the silent drill squad, and suddenly we just got a command. Everybody who volunteered for 32 Battalion, for 31 Battalion, and I think the odd other unit had to go and form up quickly. We formed up, and then we were told, look, you have to go to those units sooner. You cannot stay for the passing out parade. And you suddenly were told you've got a few hours to pack your stuff and go on a weekend's leave to go and say goodbye to your parents, because you don't know when you're going to see them again. And we then borrowed Jurgens Huishamen's 1200 or 1400 bakkie, and there were 4 of us in it with our kit, and we took turns traveling up to Joburg and lying in the back on our kit, so we had sort of 2 or 3 days at home saying goodbye to everybody, and then returned afterwards and were put on a Flossie or a C-130 to fly up to Grootfontein. Arriving in Grootfontein, they then put us into different vehicles, and obviously now you've got the NCOs that were one-liners, lance corporals. We were the candidate officers, and we thought, wow, you know, this is now our time. We're now going to be, you know, officers and NCOs in this unit. Fantastic. So we got onto our SAML 100, the guys that were going to Rundu to 32 Battalion. And we packed it in a way that we could almost sleep on it. So all of us slept, and then on the route from Grootfontein to Rundu, I think we slept quite well, and we were calm and relaxed, because now, you know, we're going to be staff members. Lo and behold, we stopped in front of the HQ at Rundu. Now, 32 Battalion's HQ was basically a corrugated iron little, a few buildings on the edge of the airstrip at Rundu. Later on, they built a thatched tea room. That was quite a beautiful building. But that was it. The main base was in Buffalo, 200 kilometers east of that. So we sort of were still sleepy when we moved into the base, parked in front of the HQ, and gradually we were getting up and, you know, hanging around, still sitting. And then around the corner, arrived the RSM of 32 Battalion, Sergeant Major Ike's Ickerman. But the first thing you saw was the whiskers and the moustache of this man, and then this voice that put the fear of God into us. And he just said, "You've got 30 seconds, and all the kit will be packed neatly in a heap somewhere, and you will be standing in a platoon." And we thought, okay, AKGK. In other words, now we're going to have some shit. We thought that we're now going to have a calm, relaxed time. And I think it was planned that way as well, to make it very difficult, to not make us feel welcome, but for us to start going through a selection process. So the expectation of being a staff member was dashed very quickly. And we then had to sleep in a tent that night without any lights, and we were told, remove your Alpha company or whatever company you were coming from at the School of Infantry, remove that flash in whatever way. We don't want to see a single thread of that on your sleeve the next day. So we took whatever lights and lighters we had and blades, and we cut away that stuff. But you can imagine, I think for months I still had a small hole in my one sleeve. The next morning we had to get onto a vehicle again and then drive to Buffalo. We arrived at Buffalo, which is obviously a number of buildings. It's not a defensible base. It was a number of buildings that were dotted down the Kavango River. And our training area was obviously the last couple of kilometers before the river went into Botswana. So it's just above the Okavango Delta. So we arrived and we stopped in front of the QM store, and each one was issued with an R1 rifle and 5 rounds only. But you could see these were like really old rifles. When I looked at the barrel, I could see, as they say, a whole herd of elephants in the barrel. And so we had to keep that clean and with the basic kit. So they gave us old kit as well, and each one received a 81 mortar round holder that contains, I think, 4 rounds, but those holders were filled with concrete. And you had to add that to your kit. You had the basic water bottles, and that's what you had. So they pulled a sandbag, a Hessian bag over our faces so that we couldn't see where we were going. And in that hot sun, they took us to the opposite side of the river. Now, fortunately, I could make the connection because I could hear them going over the bridge. And they took us around on the western side of the Kavango River, basically opposite the training area of 32 Battalion. And that's where we were told to sleep for the night. But it was planned. I mean, we had Bushman van Rijn, we had Vola, Wolmerans. They were all, I think, Bravo company leaders were then in the base at that stage on base leave and duty. And Captain Cully Illenveld, rest in peace, was the leading up the induction, if I can call it that, the orientation. And he had a number of NCOs and officers who helped them. But obviously what they did is, they acted, some of them acted as if they were drunk. And then they would take number 7 grenade, that's obviously without the fragmentation part, and chuck that amongst us to upset us. And we couldn't actually sleep. And the next morning, the first time, I heard about the fact that you can swim around across a river with all your kit, with a shelter. We had to do that practically. They had one boat there, and they chucked a few hand grenades in the river to scare the crocodiles and probably the hippos. And then we had to put all our kit into our shelter with our rifle and swim across. I think that was one of the scariest moments in my life because, you never know what's under there. And, later on in the year when we lost some guys and some of them were attacked by crocodiles, we realized how scary and how big those crocodiles actually were. So we swam across, and then each syndicate was formed in, I think, 5 people per syndicate. And we had to walk on a compass bearing in different directions. And then you had to go to an RV point, a map grid reference point. And from there, you were then directed to other places. And we spent a few days doing that. had to cross back over the river again with our kit. Now, unfortunately, some of the other syndicates lost their kit and had to walk barefoot and in their underpants until they got new kit. And you can imagine how a new kit would chafe you. So I felt sorry for some of the guys. And then we made the mistake on the first day for our syndicate to arrive at our end point very quickly. Now, you learn very quickly and very, rapidly. And that meant for the few hours that the others were hanging around in the bush, we had to do PT and do whatever. So there was no award for performing. You suffered. I mean, I think it was about checking whether you really wanted to be there and wanted to be in the unit, and it wasn't about the glamour. And to see whether you could work with lack of sleep, etc. Now, unfortunately, next to the road, so we walked up next to the white road that connected basically Rundu, Buffalo, and then Oshaka, the Far East, Wenella, and all of those places in the Eastern Caprivi. So on that road, they had these concrete water dams, small dams, but it had sort of rotten water, etc. So my unfortunate experience was that I became quite ill with jippo guts the next day, and I started dehydrating. So a couple of nights later, I was quite dehydrated because I didn't stop vomiting, and I got a drip, and I was put in the temporary hospital for a while for that night. And they just ran lots of drips through me, intravenous drips. And the next day, I was able to get out and then continue with walking along the road. So we walked up and down the road. We tried all sorts of techniques to shorten the path. On one stage, there was a cattle truck coming past, and we got onto that vehicle and we shortened the road, but nobody realized that they need to contend with Captain Carly Ihlenfeld. So he was driving up and down the road, and he realized that there were not tracks on the road. So he went to fetch us, and we had to walk all the way back and then go back again. So again, I think he'd seen it all. He was cleverer than us, and we actually had to go and do the kilometers again. So the last part of it was with obviously tar poles that were quite heavy, and we walked into the training area and then slept over that first night. So the next day we were going to start doing our training on foreign weapons, and we were going to do the Portuguese language training. And at that same time, our 2IC Major Bula Niman arrived, and he said one of us had to volunteer to become the assistant ADJ for a month or 6 weeks until the ADJ arrived from School of Infantry. He was then an ex-teacher or teacher with a full loot, and he didn't go through the selection with us. As they put pressure on us for somebody to volunteer, I then put up my hand and I said, okay, I will go and do that. But that was the biggest mistake I ever made in the military, because I was this young, naive, candidate officer, and suddenly I was involved in the politics and all of the admin that had to do with Sector 20 and represent 32 battalions at briefing meetings and stuff like that. And it was not easy because, as I said, the candidate officer has white lines, which are landing strips for the crap of all the officers. So wherever I would walk in Rundu at that stage, I got crap. And I got crapped out by NCOs, by anybody, just because that was the culture. You you give a candidate officer crap. So I was there for a month, and the moment that Lieutenant Eugene de Melon arrived, I then went to the commander and I said, please, can I go back to the companies immediately? I cannot see myself doing this type of work ever. Now, we were in the ops room, and I think I got a very good example and an overview of the war as it was going on at that stage. So from that point of view, I fully learned how to run, from the senior officers, the conversations that they have, the briefings that they have. I sat into all of those, and that was interesting to see the war being fought from that point of view against the entire wall in the ops room. We had the map of northern Namibia, southern Angola, and it was just interesting to see, all the units across the entire front moving around. So I then applied, as I said, to move back to the companies. And at that stage, Alpha Company, under command of Lieutenant Leon Duplessis, but Fedup, as we knew him, he's actually an English-speaking Duplessis. But obviously, you can imagine in the SADF, any English speaker had to learn Afrikaans for self-defense. So he was obviously fully bilingual. And Alpha Company was going to go into retraining. Now, at 32 Battalion, every 6 weeks, you would either be in Angola operating, or you would be on base duty, or you would be on leave, or you would be on retraining. So I was fortunate. I joined Alpha Company, and I could go through the almost 6 weeks full retraining that they did. So each company did full retraining once a year at least. So I could then learn all about the weapons and all the things that I missed, with the original training. Learn to speak more Portuguese. We had some wonderful sergeants who actually took me under their wing. I would just say the 32 Battalion Portuguese soldiers, ex-Angolans, were absolutely amazing soldiers. Not only the non-commissioned officers, but each of the troops. I mean, there were some of the troops that were in their early 40s, and I was 19 years old. And yet every year with the new national servicemen, they would retrain you. They would guide you. They would keep you safe. They would almost wipe your nose and your ass if you didn't know how to do that in the bush. And I quickly learned about the tactics and the way of working from the Alpha Company doctrines and training. And I must just say, Fedup was an amazing soldier. I heard lots of stories of him operating, in the bush, a very effective, disciplined soldier. Earlier this week, it was 16 years now since his death. He died in Afghanistan protecting United Nations people, and who was killed, unfortunately, in a helicopter crash. Fedup took me under his wing. I had to train with him, drink with him sometimes, and I really learned about being a soldier from him and all the NCOs, officers in Alpha Company, and also then obviously the Angolan NCOs and troops. Wonderful company. So I was dealt into Alpha 4, as they would call, excuse my language, a sparpeel, or how would you say, a spare dick, which meant that J.C. Steyn, who was then the platoon commander, was a July intake national serviceman. So when he left in July, I would then take over Alpha 4. I worked then with Alpha Company for January, February. Then very early in March, Major Bulan Niman, our 2IC, arrived at Buffalo, and if he arrived there and he wanted to speak to you, you know there was something big happening. And he called me, obviously knowing me from Rundu, this young, naive candidate officer. Okay, by that time I'd already got my PIP, and he wanted to see me, and I thought, oh damn, what did I do wrong? Was there something that still I made a mistake in in head office? But anyway, he called me and he said, we need you to move you to Delta Company. So I moved to Delta Company, Delta 16, 4 days before we had troop. Now, you can understand that with 32 Battalion being in Angola for 6 weeks, out of Angola, in and out, every time that you moved into Angola, you would know that you could be at risk of dying. So I think some of the troops who were drinking got totally sloshed. You had to go and fetch them sometimes, at their houses and move them by vehicle to the parade ground where we formed up. My challenge was just I didn't know any of my troops because I was a new fledgling. But I had a wonderful couple of mentors. The first mentor was Tomo Thompson. I knew him as Tomo. I think he's still in the Cape Province, Western Province, who was a wonderful mentor. He was the NCO. Now, you must also understand that in 32 Battalion, rank did not matter. Experience did, skills did. So he taught me everything I need to know. Secondly was Sergeant Jeremiah Segundo, who was the platoon sergeant. He is now a pastor in the Rustenburg area, and somebody that I need to go and look up before the end of this year. A wonderful person, and he just said to me, Lieutenant, we're going to work together. I'll show you everything, and I'll also be honest with you. And that's how I learned. He really taught me everything about running a platoon. And then I had a wonderful friend who was the 2IC of the platoon, also coming in with my intake, Bernard Mathieu. He actually stays and works in Switzerland. No names, no pectorals. A wonderful person who became an internal auditor. And I then went with the platoon into southern Angola. So we stopped at Ruacana for a few days, and during that time, Operation Super occurred. The big battle where Kenneth and Alpha Company, Foxtrot and Golf were involved. And I think the hardest part for me was at that stage knowing that the ones that I trained with, Alpha Company, Fedup and so on, were in the battle, and 4 days ago I was part of them. And now I couldn't go there because I had to look after my own platoon. Especially when the chopper arrived with full steward's body bag. At that stage, there was confusion whether it was a full steward or Piet Neetlik, because of the camouflage and obviously the blood and so on. And only later did were we told no, when they did the proper identification, that it was full steward. At that stage, I was really torn between my loyalty to Delta Company and my experience and history with Alpha Company. And I also realized about the psychology of war and the impact that it had on people and loss. So I think those events had a huge impact on me. Sitting at Ruacana, not being able to go and help in that battle. So we then were flown into the Humbi area, where our platoon did vehicle ambushes. At some stage, we were flown to the west, where one of the platoons got attacked overnight by the enemy. And I felt sorry for that platoon, because there was a comedy of errors that happened. Being a Patmore or a 60mm mortarist and knowing the mortars, when I went to look at the contact area, I realized that the mortarist didn't put the two mortars on fire. They were still unsafe. And 2 mortars pegged right in front of the half moon position that SWAPO took in the attack of the platoon. So if those 2 mortars exploded, they would have taken out the whole line of SWAPO at that stage. And it just showed you the importance of preparation of your equipment for the night. So the rest of our operation in March was fairly uneventful. I must just say that terrain was quite challenging, because after the summer rains in March, we would sometimes walk for days and hours in knee-deep water, in boot-deep water. Sometimes we'd sleep on islands around an ant hill that you can imagine how big that ant colony is, because that's the only places that you could sleep. And the area around you was was at least ankle-deep water. At that stage, I realized the importance of bush discipline, of having sound and light discipline towards the end of the day. I learned about the importance of our logistics people, because at that stage the military ran out of tabard, the mosquito ointment that you would put on as a barrier, and for a week we slept without tabard in that mosquito infested area. I also realized the importance of knowing the bush, because at some stage we walked through an area and suddenly we heard a noise, and we went down and we waited, and some of the troops found an area in a small wood that had massive mushrooms, and I'm talking the size of a table, these perfectly white mushrooms. And we could actually have a whole meal as a platoon just from those mushrooms, by taking your soup powder and eating a mushroom soup. So I learned a lot in my first bush trip. And then obviously life on buffalo. When you were not in operation, when you were not training, when you were not on duty or on leave, you'd spend wonderful days in buffalo, because you're on the Kavango River, you'd go and fish, you'd swim in the shallow parts of the river, obviously checking for crocodiles and so on. And obviously buffalo was in a nature reserve. Certain times of the year, you would have elephants and hippos roaming through the camp. On occasions, when we would go for a run, you'd run into a herd of 100, 200 buffalo. And then obviously, you'd climb the nearest tree. So that was actually wonderful experiences that we had. Then in July, up to July, we were staying in basically grass huts with a concrete floor slab and a corrugated roof right on the Kavango River. Now, in July, we received concrete bungalows. It had just a netting as windows, and then a corrugated roof. That was much better, and we had wonderful times in those bungalows. So in July, mid-July, we then trooped in for Operation Meebos. Spent some days in Onjiva preparing for it, and then Delta Company stayed a bit longer to help with the defense of Onjiva, with the parabats. And then we started moving north for Operation Meebos. And it meant that the unit or the operation commander then was a person who came from the artillery, and he used the 1 to 250,000 map. Now, infantry uses a 1 to 50,000 map, which means that the distances between his index finger and his pinky was 5 times further than we had on our maps. And what we had to do is walk from Onjiva up to, Ivali, Mupa area, and then we actually met up with 6-1 Mech Rattles in that area. We established a HAG in the area of Ivali, Mupa, if I recall correctly. And that's where the military then started with a number of operations against the SWAPO battalions. It's this year's 40 years, if I now come to think of it. And at that stage, Willem Rotte and the 32 Battalion Recce Group were looking for the 3 battalions. And one of the battle indicators was the fact that the SWAPO had a lot of cattle with them, and that they would move that around, and obviously also covered their own tracks with that. And what happened is that Willem Rotte then said to the commander at that stage, give us another night or two, and we can then pinpoint the concentration of SWAPO. Because what had happened with the different attacks of where we had information that their bases were, that the SWAPO withdrew and they all concentrated together, which meant for each battalion, they had 3 14,5 heavy machine guns that were on a small two-wheeled vehicle that you could pull like a trailer, but you could even pull it by hand, but you could obviously attach it to a vehicle. So it meant that concentration of SWAPO had about 9 14,5s amongst them. And obviously that's a significant threat to any helicopter or any aircraft. And Willem Rotte said, please, can we give us another night or two to just pinpoint these guys so that we can attack that concentration. And the decision from the top was then taken, no, you are all going to do area operations. So it meant that the helicopters, the 8 Pumas came in, and we were going to be trooped first, and then Alpha Company, 1st Parachute Battalion was going to be trooped in those 8 choppers. And because I was the 2nd stick in the 4th platoon in Delta Company, I went to the last chopper of the 8. So they all parked in the HAG area, and with the Rattles obviously around surrounding us and so on. And before we took off, I actually joked with the crew, Twaddle and so on, that you know what, you're flying one of these older model aircraft, is this still airworthy? And we joked, we always drag one another, and so they said, they would joke and say, I hope your kit is not too heavy, and we sort of ragged one another. And you know what, it was the only time ever that I felt afraid to get into the aircraft. So I must have had some premonition, because as the others, the 7 in front of us started taking up, ours was just lifting and going down, lifting, just by probably 300 millimeters, not very high, but I just sat there and I wanted to get out of this aircraft as soon as I could. So we were flown to an area, as I understand, around Kuvalai, and we were going to be placed close to the road, because 32 Battalion is more experienced with vehicle ambushes, because we heard that there was going to be a convoy of vehicles coming from the top. So we were placed close to a road, the entire Delta Company. Obviously, the gunships were going ahead because they're slower, and they would go and secure the area for us, etc. Neil Ellis and some of the other pilots, Harry and so on. And then once they dropped us off, they flew back to the Hague. They picked up the Parabats, and the Parabats were actually flying over us, and I think in a more westerly direction, if I'm not mistaken. And we actually waved at them as they came over. And at that stage, for some reason, the chopper that I was in, that was the 8th chopper, moved to the 5th position of that 8 choppers. And about 11 kilometers from us, we just heard that there was something happening. And the only real info we got was when one of the gunships shouted, "I'm going down, I'm going down." And what had happened then is that as they were flying us out, one of the choppers went and picked up Willem Rotta and his team to take them to the Hague to go and report back. And Willem and the team they flew over the concentration of SWAPO that were in a riverbed under trees, a dry riverbed. And Willem jumped out of the chopper and ran in and said to them, "Tell the choppers, don't take that same route. You're going to fly over the enemy." And that was either the message didn't get there soon enough, or it was ignored. I'm not going to speculate on that, but that meant that the SWAPO were then prepared because the choppers flew over them initially. And as they came over, they started firing at the Puma. The Puma dropped, the one that I was in, probably an hour earlier. Everybody was killed. We didn't know that at that stage. And obviously, a number of the other passengers of the Parabats were also injured in other choppers. The Alouette that was then damaged. All his instruments were damaged, and that's why the pilot assumed that he was going down. We then told him to come and land at our spot, because then we could secure him and he could check through his chopper. And there were holes through the blades, there were holes through the cabin. I know the flight engineer, they usually wore these short ankle high fellies, as we call them, leather shoes. The perspex of the chopper actually, shot holes into his ankle and legs, from the 14.5 round. We secured the chopper. He realized that he could fly back to the Hague, and obviously for repairs, and then he left. Our company commander then, Harry Ferreira, then asked for permission that the other choppers with the bats land at our space, allow us to get into the choppers and take on the enemy. And unfortunately, he was threatened by some senior officer with court-martial if we would do that. And he was told in no uncertain terms to stand down. So we had a very difficult afternoon and night, because we felt that we should have done something about that. We then moved further towards the contact area. And as you would have remembered from Neil Ellis's story, the enemy moved 10 kilometers north that night, and he picked them up the next morning. So the next morning, when the intel came through, we want 2 platoons ready. It was my platoon and Henk Meyer's platoon, Delta 16, Delta 14, that got the straw this time to be. We always pulled straws, and we took turns to take on, if the whole company couldn't get into the action. And we started walking towards the objective. At some stage, the rattles of 6-1 Meg came past. We climbed on top of that, and we started driving towards the area, the objective area. And Eventually, the Pumas arrived from Namibia because they always slept in Namibia. They didn't sleep over in Angola because of the cost and the risk of losing them. I can fully understand that. And the Pumas then picked us up and flew us towards the objective area. So it was quite an open area. Our right flank was a river, and the left flank was obviously open area. It was sparse vegetation, knee, ankle deep grass at places, but typically dry savanna in a winter veld. And as we were flying in, I just recall the smoke, some of the columns of smoke there, because by that stage, the aircraft had already bombed the area to try to suppress the 14-5s, because over an open terrain, I mean, you cannot come close to a 14-5. It has a much larger range, and obviously it can be used in a ground defense role as well. So we got out of our choppers, the 2 platoons, and we opened the sweep line under Harry Ferreira's command, our company commander. And unfortunately, because of the bombing, the veld caught fire. And we had to maintain our extended sweep line, because the moment that you bunch, you would be ideal target for the enemy. And unfortunately for Harry and myself, as we were going through the fire, and I mean, on the farms, as at school years, I would visit my uncle on the farm, and we fought many a veld fire with bags, Hessian bags, filled and dunked in water and so on. So one learned to see some of those trends, and we were just unfortunate. The moment that we went through those fires, there weren't large flames. There was a quick whirlwind that created a hotspot, and the heat unfortunately burned Harry and myself. So Harry's arms were burnt. Unfortunately, I had my sleeves rolled down, but my face and my hands burnt. And because we had black camouflage cream, obviously that burnt into my skin. That was painful, but we kept on. I just said to myself, this is now the one big fight in my life. I'm not going to leave. My medic gave me, I think, a few Disprins or paracetamols, and I just kept I had a piece of cloth, I kept it wet, because fortunately we were close to the river, and I just refilled my water bottle, and I kept it wet, and I just kept, till the pain sort of moved. So we were fighting sporadic fights with the enemy through the day. We got a number of 14-5s that were obviously left by the enemy, and in some cases the enemy was killed. At some stage in the morning, so we arrived on the objective about 10 o'clock, between 10 and 11. We burned shortly after we arrived there. And we fought through the objective until about late afternoon, about 4 or 5 o'clock. I know the sun was starting to set. But I must give a lot of acknowledgement to the pilots, the Air Force pilots. At some stage, the gunship pilots would call in mirages again, because the 14-5s were getting active again, and they came to bomb in front of us, and that was an amazing sight and experience to observe that. But apart from the 2, Harry and I, who burned, there were no casualties on that side. So we were really blessed on that day. The nearest other risk was that the mortarman of platoon 14, later that afternoon, because we had gunships and so on, we couldn't use the mortars a lot, etc. He realized that there was a hole in the pipe, and as he upended it, the round fell out. So some enemy actually had quite an accurate shot directed at him. So we worked through the objective, and the final count, and again, I say a lot of that, the kills were by the gunships. There were about, it was around 108 to 113 of the enemy. I think the sad part of that for me was the fact that as we were pulling the kit of the parabats as we got it, and we pulled some of the bodies together and so on, in the same pocket that I was wearing, where I used to store my Bible, there was a young man who had a letter from his family and a Bible in the same pocket. And I think that hit me. And I think at that stage, I said to myself, God, I don't understand this. You know, what are we busy with? And I think that prompted me to probably become a psychologist, because I just couldn't understand what was going on. I think the further operations, by late afternoon, I could see a little bit through my left eye. I was full of blisters, and obviously dirty and smelly, and my hands were full of blisters and stuff like that. And, you know, obviously we had some contacts, and very close contacts with some of the enemy during the day. I know on the right flank, there were 2 of the enemy with rifle grenades, which they used very effectively. And they were hiding in the donga on the river, probably to attack us from behind, because that is a very good, would have been a wonderful tactic. And, you know, I took them out with a hand grenade. So that was really a almost face-to-face contact that we had, but most of it was at a distance. And then by the evening, we dug in, and I decided that I was going to sleep over, because usually they bomb our area. And the next morning, I could still see a little bit through one eye. When they dropped one of the photographers, Harry and I then went into the Hague to go and get some medical treatment. And I eventually ended up for 2 weeks in Grootfontein Hospital in the casualty ward. The rest of my 1982 was, we did further operations. We didn't have really serious fights. We had the sporadic contacts that we would typically have, but I think Meebos was to us, to me, was a real tipping point. So I wanted to join short service, just because I think the money was appealing, but I left it for too late. So when I sort of applied in December, I was told, look, we can't confirm that you're going to join, because we're not certain about budget. And I found myself, you know, okay, that, you know, that in that uncertainty. So I decided, okay, let me go back home. And we got a lift with Hannes Lindveld, who had just bought a bakkie, a 3-liter Ford bakkie. And we all packed some of us packed our stuff on the bakkie, and we slept over the first night after obviously going to Rundu, hearing that there were no aircraft available for a week. Hannes told us, no, you can go with me. We slept with Frank Baltus Bosch in Tsumeb on the farm, and the next evening we were in Uppington. So we you know, Hannes was quite efficient in the way that he drove. And then in December, when I got home, that was like just around Christmas, I then decided, okay, what am I going to study, or if possible? None of the varsities wanted to take me, so I ended up at the Rand Afrikaans University, that's now called the University of Johannesburg. And the only course I could get into at that late stage was was psychology, anthropology, and political science. So I said to myself, okay, I'm going to do this, and maybe then I'll apply for medicine. And I think, God has a plan with you. I ended up enjoying varsity life so much. I got involved in social and other activities that I really enjoyed, and I decided to stay. So I studied full-time for a few years, and then I was placed at 2nd Battalion Transvaal Scottish. And then at the end of my first year, I participated in Operation Askari, where a few days after our exam, we were flown in to Rundu. We were issued that night in the tea room, and we slept in the tea room at the HQ of 32 Battalion, and we were flown in to join the companies at Yondi. We worked through Operation Askari. Fortunately, I was then back in Delta Company. I was a platoon commander for a month, and then when the company commander left, I took over for that month until we could get a replacement. And during that time, we had the privilege to work with Willem Ratta and his team a lot. We would do the vehicle ambushes. We would work with his team, and we had typical first light, attacks. We would walk through the night to a base that was identified, to the early morning attacks. But there weren't really serious fights that we engaged in. Our task as 32 Battalion was to maintain, a barrier in the north, so that 6-1 Mech and 4-Psi and so on could do their work at Kuvalai. I think the only big event was being pounded by Grad 122mm rockets one night. They weren't. I think the closest that one fell was about 50 meters from me. But the sound of it, because we were lying next to the mountain, and the sound reflecting off the mountain was horrible. It felt like the rockets fell on top of us. I then decided to continue my studies, and studied part-time at the stage, worked, and was selected to go and do my master's degree in psychology. During that time, I would do annual camps through RAU Military Unit, because I was transferred there. The military units were created to allow us to do our obligatory service, whether at the, during the varsity vacations. So I became the commander for the infantry corps at the military unit, which meant I looked at the career development and the training of all the members in infantry, to ensure that we had people on strength for camps, to send them to camps, to ensure that they got their promotions and so on. So I did that for 3 years part-time. And then I also did my camps at the Joint Management Committees, the old GBS as they would call it, for a couple of Decembers, as secretary for Witwatersrand Joint Management Committee, when Commandant Johan Venter was on leave. And I was very fortunate that I could do a camp or a course every year for promotion. So my last camp was December, January 1981, 1989, 1990, yes. And in my last month, I did my camp as a major. So I was fortunate to move through the ranks and just do camps and training at exactly the right times and so on. So why all of this? If one reflects back on your military career, you know that it was a short time in your life, but it was a time that had a huge impact on us. And I think any military veteran that suffered or had a difficulty or had the risk, running the risk of losing your life, experience some form of trauma, whether it's real or whether it's imagined. I would say some of my most traumatic nights in Angola was when we had to look after the kit of our company, and suddenly there was a full moon and I was lying feeling as if I was under some floodlights. It's not that something happens to you, but your brain creates those images of what's the worst that can happen. And they say people suffer lots of trauma, some of which actually happens. So in a nutshell, I think that was probably the reason when I started working as a psychologist, and I started working in business all my life. And I kept a part-time pro bono practice, and which meant that I started helping veterans from all sides of the conflict. And fortunately, I think I've built up a name where I can help, and I can help quickly. So I absolutely love that. That's my first love. And I do charge if people have medical aid and have money. I must admit that I only started charging from February this year. Beforehand, if somebody really wants to pay, they can pay something. But I know I have a bureau that does the admin, because I realized I suck at admin. And but the invitation stands as I've done in the other videos, Chris. If you don't have the funds, just contact me. I can help. And I use a therapy called BWRT, brain working recursive therapy, that works rapidly and works permanently. I've had really the privilege in the last number of years to help veterans that have been walking around with those ghosts of the past, whether that presented through, unable to sleep, flashbacks, fear, anger, broken marriages, broken relationships, loss of jobs, alcoholism, any of the symptoms of PTSD, that I've been able to help in a rapid and a permanent way. I wouldn't say that I always help and I always help immediately and perfectly, but I think that most of I would say 95% of the veterans that I've worked with and other clients have been helped in a good way. I think the only proviso is that if you want to come and see me and you want to tell me some glorified war story, don't waste your time and don't waste my time. Some people want to tell you how they ate cats and they killed 50 of the enemy, with one magazine, a magazine that carries 20 or 35 rounds and things like that. Then I won't listen to you. But typically the therapy that I do is not about telling stories. And there is a wonderful process by Dr. Roel Schoeman where he gets people to talk, they tell their stories and so on. My therapy is to work with those that need help. It is important that people tell their story, and I think that's why Legacy Conversations is there. But I think there's a number of us that need direct psychological help, and I'm there and I'm willing and able to help you. Because I know I've been all over the place. I hope this gives you a little bit of a background to me. I clearly will have to edit a lot here and change a lot of the crap I was speaking, but thank you for the wonderful opportunity. And I think we'll just put my contact details in if you don't mind.
Frans, thank you. We will indeed put your contact details here. And if there's anybody looking for Frans, just contact me as well if you can't get hold of him. We will forward your details towards him. But I have one question for you, Frans. You say to me right in the beginning, when you're 19 years old, you'll do something, you do it to the best of your ability. Obviously, you followed that dictum all your life. Do you think it makes it easier for a man or a woman to always try your best? Or do you think at some stage, I'm talking psychology now, fear sets in where you say it doesn't matter, you're going to fail anyway? So which of the two attitudes would be the best to adopt?
I think whether you are in a time of battle, or whether you're in a time of practicing self-care, I always say do your best. I say to leaders often, serve from your saucer, which means your cup must run over. If your cup is empty, do whatever you need to fill your cup first in an almost selfish way, rather than trying to give from an empty cup. So I would always encourage people to say, do your best. And if you feel that you cannot do your best to heal, to get yourself back into a better state so that you can face life. We have a big battle with the mind. We often think about what's the worst that can happen, what will go wrong, and if we do that, we often suffer the consequences of trauma without having trauma itself. So I would always recommend, do the best for yourself first, and then secondly for people around you.
Okay, then on a lighter note, I have a question I want to ask. You can refuse to answer it, of course. As a psychologist, you would have seen many things. And you would have dealt with people who's damaged. I don't like the word crazy. I think it's demeaning to say damaged, but some of them are really crazy. And I understand there was an old auntie in Bloemfontein at one of the hospitals who almost molested you because she was so strong. Do you wish to explain to us that, perhaps?
I just want to say that as a psychologist, looking after myself and ensuring that I provide the first best service, I still see a psychologist, different ones for different purposes, whether it's for supervision or for training. And they are still at this age. I thought I dealt with all of the ghosts of my past. I'm still actually signing on a new psychologist with a new therapy, BWRT, for me to deal with certain things that are still popping up in my life. And I'm not avoiding the story of that auntie. And so we were in Bloemfontein visiting the University of the Free State's psychology department. And they took us on a tour of Oranje Hospital, Orange Hospital, which was the psychiatric ward of that. And there was a little tiny lady, and we were walking through the wards, and now you've got the rooms and the and so on. So there was a wide corridor, and there was a tiny old little aunt in a pink nylon gown who stormed at me and grabbed me and tried to pull me to a room. And you know what? At that stage, I was still fit, strong, and could hold my own. And you know what? I almost crapped in my pants. I just couldn't get my arm released. They had to bring some orderlies to help me to escape from her. So she wanted to take me to a room, and I know that was quite a shock. But I realized sometimes the strength of a person who is in a fight, flight, freeze, or flop mode. Yeah, thank you for that reminder, Chris.
Well, Internet, I think we've answered the question here. Remember right in the beginning, I said to you that I don't want to speak to a man about psychological issues. If he's just some kind of a wanker there who went to university. I have a friend, she went through some bad times, and she said to me once, she sat looking at the psychologist who was supposed to help her, and she realized that this woman, the psychologist, the biggest problem she had in life, two of them. One was that a cat died or something, or a dog died. Well, I understand that's a bad thing. And the other thing was that She would be worried whether the maid comes or not, which in my eyes is just so much crap. So what I'm saying to you here is we are actually then lucky to have Frans van Staden here to assist us psychologically.